On this episode of The Scorekeepers, join me, Daniel Farrell, as I speak with video game composer and audio guru Jeff Penny. Jeff has been working in the video game space for several years and has contributed work on projects such as Just Cause 4 and Second Extinction. He also has done lots of work in the indie game space and is an avid educator. I'm really excited to listen to him speak about the relationships between audio and music in the game world. Welcome to The Scorekeepers. Welcome, Jeff. Great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I came across your work in one of the SCL magazines, an interview you had done with several different composers. It was really great, and I looked up your stuff, and I think you're just a phenomenal game composer, and I'm really excited to have you on the show. And before we go ahead and really dive into, your music, could you just give us like a brief introduction for our audience members?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jeff. My main focus, I would say, is composition, but I also love doing sound design. I do technical sound design implementation. I'm also a teacher. I just generally am passionate about game audio in general. I also do film and advertisement stuff too, but my main focus is definitely in games.
How'd you get started in music? And overall, were you in band or something in school, or how did you fall into it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people in my family have always played instruments, so I always just kind of grew up around music. None of them do it professionally; they just did it for fun. And so I was just naturally, like, as soon as I was old enough to play an instrument in school, I wanted to do that. That was like, I was just drawn to that. It seemed natural. And I really loved it. But it was always just something I kind of did for fun. Like, I remember so clearly, I was in, because I started on saxophone. I was in a saxophone lesson, like one of the first ones I had with a private teacher in middle school. And he starts talking about what I'm going to do for college and for career and stuff. And I'm just like, I just doing this because I like it. I never like thought about it as like a career or something that I would take seriously. Just something I did for fun. And then when I got to high school, one of the requirements was that when you were in the lower band, well, actually all the other bands, you had to listen to the other bands in the concert. You couldn't just like leave. You had to actually listen to the other students. And I listened to the upperclassmen band, like the wind ensemble was like the highest level. And they played this piece called Passing Fantasy by Fisher Tull. And it like blew my mind. Like, I'm like, I never knew that music could like have this like emotional quality to it. And that's very specific was the moment like, okay, music is the thing that I want to do. Like, this is so cool. This is my life now.
Was that the moment that you knew it was composition that you wanted to focus in on, or did you kind of discover composing later on?
No, then it was just music. I mean, I think I kind of, this sounds bad to say, but it's not quite what I mean. I kind of defaulted a little bit to wanting to do music ed because I'm like, okay, my music teachers inspire me, so I could just do that thing because it's the thing I knew already. And like, I mean, I still teach. I do like teaching, but that didn't ultimately end up being where I wanted to end up. It was just kind of like my initial thought. I'm like, I want to do music. I could teach it. That's a way to do music.
I think a lot of people that they want to pursue music of some sort. Music ed is kind of one of the first choices, like you said, because it's the one thing that you're exposed to all the time.
Yeah, like I don't think I even had like a concept that like there were composers for games at that time. Like it wasn't even like a thing I like understood existed.
So what was the moment that you were like, yeah, this game music thing is kind of cool. I want to kind of push into that area.
Yeah, so that was a bit later. Like I said, I originally started at school for music ed, and I was enjoying that. But as I was doing it more, I noticed that the music ed classes I was taking felt a little bit more like a chore because like I do like teaching, but just some of the politics of being in a school and all sorts of other things that go along with it just didn't vibe with me. But the electives I was taking, like I took a jazz arranging class, and I took like a one that also is more kind of towards jazz composition. And I noticed like those assignments, I'll get really excited for. I'd like rush home to go do those assignments. And the music ed ones, I was kind of like drag my feet a little bit more. So I'm like, okay, I'm probably something's going on here. And then I was still kind of like nervous because I'm like, I already did all these years in this major. I don't know if I should really switch. But I wound up, for a whole bunch of medical reasons, I had to kind of take a few semesters off. And in that time, I'm like, okay, I need to just kind of do what makes me happy. And in that time, I was playing a lot of video games and I was writing my own music, starting to like get into writing my own music. And like, this is what this feels right. This feels what I want to do this. So that's kind of how I transitioned to it.
You mentioned, about still being a teacher and still having some involvement in music ed. I saw that you've, done a lot of work teaching and lecturing on game music and game audio. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that you were involved with?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've taught at two universities now. I'm currently teaching remotely for Quinnipiac University, but I also was previously at Long Island University. And I really like those classes because, I mean, I like game audio, so I like being able to talk about game audio. But beyond that, it's one of those topics I feel like game audio people, like people who are in this same world, they have resources, they know where to look. There's lots of stuff out there about how to learn about game audio. But for people who aren't already in this world, like other game devs, for example, like artists or programmers or whatever, I noticed that when I was working on games, they very often knew almost nothing about how the audio actually worked.
Hmm.
Not just about how it's made, but how it works in engine, the best ways to optimize it, all this stuff. I'm like, this is like a whole. Like every time I'm working on a new game, I have to teach the developers often how audio
Wow.
works. So I'm like, if I can teach these classes, I can maybe mitigate that in the future, where not necessarily for myself, but like for someone else, that like if a developer can understand how the audio process works better, then they can integrate it into their game better and just have a smoother, better experience overall. So I'm really big proponent of, even if you're not, even if you don't want to be your entire life dedicated to game audio, that's cool. But maybe if you're making a game, just understanding the fundamentals of how all the parts of it work will make you be able to do your own job better, just because you understand how it fits in with the whole better.
Were a lot of the students that take these various classes that you've taught, were some of them musicians? Were some of them just game developers? Was it one more than the other?
Well, I mean, they're all students from the game development program. So all of them are in some kind of game design, but one or two of them would like have played instruments before, but none of them were really like none of them were like game audio is
Right.
their focus going into this class. A few of them afterwards tell me that they realized how much they like game audio and want to do it more, which that made my heart very happy. But none of them like came in with
Right.
that background. So it's a lot of teaching from the ground up.
What do you think is like, because I've had a couple guests on talking about game composing and game audio integration and stuff like that. And it always kind of seems like this overwhelming kind of topic. What do you think is like one of the most challenging aspects when it comes to working with game audio?
I mean, it's hard. It's a little bit hard for me to say because I've been doing it for so
Right.
long now that just like
I'm a
I'm like
whiz.
having a weird perspective on it. Not even that. Just like I have no perspective from
Right,
what the
right.
outside looks like anymore. But I think a lot of it just comes down to training your brain to think in a certain way. And that kind of is a general statement, but I think it applies to most of the issues in game audio. In like composition, for example, it's a different way of thinking about how to write a piece of music versus how to write a piece of music that can go anywhere, that it can adapt in real time. Like you need to just approach it in a fundamentally different way than I would if I was just writing a piece of music to listen to, because there's just less considerations for that. Or even like writing to picture, you have to know how to like hit certain sync points and line things up. And that's just, I wouldn't say that's harder or easier. It's just
Mm.
a different skill set. And that kind of thing comes up a lot in sound design. You have to think about how it's going to be implemented, how you can create more variation, how it can adapt based on what the player is doing. And it's just that kind of mindset of thinking about how can I kind of take into account every single permutation that might happen in how I'm designing these. And it's not actually the techniques of doing it. Once you get the techniques, it's actually pretty easy to do those things. It's just a matter of learning how to think in that way. So when you're creating things, you can slot them into that system easily.
When you're working on, because you mentioned you do some film or some commercial work sometimes. Do you approach that? I assume you approach that with a different mindset than game audio and game music, but like, is it a difficult thing to snap your brain out of the game audio space for those mediums, or how do you reframe yourself?
I would say a little bit. It's a little bit difficult. And I would definitely say I am not as competent at it as people who like their entire thing is
Right.
writing to film. Like they're going to be much better at that stuff than I am. But I don't know if I really have to reframe it so much as it's almost like refreshing in some ways because it's just different. So it's like I'm so used to doing it this one way. It's nice to kind of get a change every once in a while. But like I said, I also probably am not as strong at that as someone who fundamentally does that as their main thing.
So the trailer for Game of Fortune, the Game of Fortune, I should say, dropped a few weeks back, which you're doing the music and also audio on it, doing all the audio work on that.
That one's just music.
Just music. Can you walk us through what the process was like creating the music for that?
So that one in particular, for anyone who's not familiar, it's a death game, which is very harsh name, but that's the type of game it is. But it's basically one of those like horror thriller genres where a bunch of people compete in a game and try not to die. Basically, like Squid Game was a big
I was
popular
gonna say
one and
it's
that
like
kind of thing.
Squid Game.
Yeah, a little bit like that style. But so I had never worked on a project in that style of game before, and it was really fun. I really like to write music that is strong in some emotional way. Like real like if it's intense, I want it to be really intense. If it's like sad, I want it to be really sad. Like I gravitate towards extremes, I guess. So that genre very much kind of played into that and I had a lot of fun kind of coming up with the music. And the lead dev on it, Kenneth, is also really good in that he gave me lots of references, like of whenever there was something he wanted. He told me like he would give me music from other games, and he did a really great job of just making it clear what he was after. And then it became just me sort of fitting my own aesthetic and thoughts into the framework that he did a great job of laying out.
From a musical sense, what was your process through composing? Are you a sit at a piano kind of person? Are straight into the DAW kind of? What is your creative process for game music?
Well, I mean, I'm always in a DAW. I rarely ever do anything outside of a computer just because I don't know. That's how I think at this
Right.
point. But the actual process depends a little bit. I kind of, for this game in particular, I broke the music into kind of like chunks, almost like not quite suites, but like sort of thinking of them as suites. So like the puzzle kind of music would all fit into one palette, or like the action music might fit into one palette, or the emotional music might fit into one palette. And then I kind of once I developed those palettes, it's just a matter of writing in those instrumentations. And in retrospect, I probably could have done this stronger, but like once I would write one piece and have themes in that, I would then be able to use those themes in other things. But I didn't like start off with themes and then figure out like this whole way to make them interconnected. It was just kind of like writing some pieces of music and then relating back to the ones I had already written. But I mostly segmented it based on how the music would be were functioning in the game. Like I said, puzzle or action or sad or mystery, whatever it was.
Is that process that you had for the Game of Fortune? Is that the same kind of process you approach all of the games that you work on?
Not really. I This probably isn't great also, but I tend to like to change things up a lot. So, I mean, the idea of starting with a palette of instruments and having some kind of sense of the sound I'm going for is that's pretty much across the board how I do. I will always come up with a sound palette first and foremost. But then the actual writing process changes a lot depending on the project. Also on the style of music. Like I find if I'm writing orchestral music, I will write a piano sketch, and that is a much better way for me to start. And then I'll start orchestrating from the piano sketch I already wrote. But if I'm writing something that's more electronic based, something about the way the synthesizer patches actually function is informing the way I'm writing them. So writing it
Right.
on a piano first doesn't really work, and I will end up having to write in the synthesizer first. So it really depends on what my end result is, the actual process. But I always do start with like some kind of palette in mind. That's usually my go-to.
So you had also worked on Just Cause 4 and Second Extinction, which are two pretty big games. So what was the experience like working on those projects as part of a team versus, being the sole composer on a smaller indie game?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's definitely a very different process, but like right off the bat, the obvious answer is that it was incredible. Like the lead composer, Zach Abramson, is one of my favorite people to work with. I love him. But just being surrounded by all these people who, especially at the time, had way more experience than I did was great in that I just learned so much. Like I learned a lot in school, but there's just a different way of
Mhm.
learning when you're actually on the job seeing people do the thing practically, that I feel like I learned more working on those projects than I could have like through any other method. Which is unfortunate because not everyone has that luxury to just
Right. Yeah, sometimes just like in the pressure cooker, just being surrounded by people, you just like pick up so much faster than being in, a classroom or something like that.
yeah, absolutely. And then being able my thing especially is I am very big on understanding the way people work and then not trying to like imitate the way they work, but just like taking little snippets of lots of different people's workflows and incorporating it into things that make sense for me. And so that was really great, especially working on a team. I could see all the people on the team, how they all have their own tendencies and which of those tendencies I liked and being able to bring them into my work. And like if you could, I don't think there's much on the internet purposely, but if you could find music I wrote just before that project, just before Just Cause 4, and the music I wrote right after it, like you hear like a huge growth in what I was able to do. So just for my own personal selfish thing, I really love that. But it was also really cool because, like you said, working on indies is a very different thing, especially when you're the entire audio team. But just being able to have that kind of collaborative process of being able to bounce ideas off of each other or like being able to help each other. I hesitate to say it's a stronger thing because I think you could come up with very great things on your own, but it's a very different experience where you can come up with a lot richer, fuller ideas than if you only have your own perspective to rely on.
What's the process like? Because I know for film, if you have a big composer, the lead composer on a film, they'll have assistants or additional writers. They'll handle the like big cues, the important cues, and they'll often hand off smaller cues for other composers. When you're dealing in game and you have, all these different layers and things that are going to be affecting the music, and there's, almost constant music sometimes in some games. What is the process like for a large team of like, how are they gonna divvy up who does what music wise?
I mean, that really definitely depends because I've heard of it done so many different ways in so many different studios. So I can really only speak to what I have done personally. But I know on the projects I've worked on, they tend to, I mean, the lead composer, like on Just Cause 4, Zach, is going to be doing the bulk of it because he's the lead composer. But
Right.
they, at least on our team, he tended to divvy up things based on what people's strengths were. So
Hmm.
like if there was someone on this one I'm just making up, but if there's someone on the team who's really good at writing like a specific type of orchestral style and they needed that for a track, they would give it to that person to work on. Or like if there's someone who's really good at synthesizers, they give it to the synthesizer person. Like we divvy it up that way. But also it tended to be very collaborative in that it's not, or is very rarely just one person writes a track and that's it. There'd be multiple people doing different parts of the tasks. Like, I know a pretty common thing in games is like one person will compose a full piece of music. They'll compose the full thing, all the instrumentation, everything orchestrated, the full thing. And then someone else will come in and take those stems and figure out how they can be broken up in a way that can adapt. And so both people, in a way, are shaping the finished musical product you're hearing. They're just at different points in the process of that creation. But then I also know that there's other games that I've worked on where some people, like one person just writes this, one person writes this, and not as collaborative intertrack wise. But I don't. I think my point is there's just a lot of different ways to do it.
It's very interesting that there's so many different ways you can approach it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's just more technical things. The only difference about that is, like I mentioned earlier, you have to be aware of how this is going to work in game. So, like, if like you have to worry about if the one cue you're writing has to be able to adapt into something else, you have to then worry about the key that the other person is writing in. And so you have to worry about the tempo the other person's writing in and whatever meter and make sure that they can go seamlessly between each other. So there's a lot more just kind of coordination that needs to be done, but it's not necessarily that different of a creative process. It's just the things you have to consider while writing it is different.
And are you guys doing all of the integration of the music, all the audio integration of the music at the same time as composing, or is there like a separate team that works with you all on the integration?
No, on those projects specifically, it was Avalanche's in-house audio team that does all the implementation. So we were just creating the music assets and sending it off to them, which on larger projects is definitely pretty standard. But that's one of the differences that I actually really love about indies is I personally like integrating my own stuff. So I like being able to be the person to actually make them and get them into the game engine. But when you have a huge team like you do on a lot of AAA stuff, I understand why that's not how it's done.
It'll take forever. But I'd also love to hear about your work in arrangements and arranging and how that maybe has shaped your compositional output.
Like I actually mentioned when I was in school originally and kind of thinking about transitioning what I was doing, I was taking jazz arranging classes. And that was kind of my first introduction into making my own music. Like I've always played music, but actually like it's not writing, but creating my own music was through arranging. And I would start arranging things for the pep band at my school or just arranging things for friends to play.
It's fun.
And it's really fun. And then the more I did it, I mean, back then I was just doing it because I was just fun. I was learning about it. But then the more serious I got about arranging stuff, my main goal was to fundamentally like change whatever it was that I was working with. So if there's a piece of game music I like and I wanted to do a cover of it, I wouldn't just perform it on the same instruments the same way or something. I would want it to be like fundamentally different than the original version, but still recognizable as the same piece of music. And that was my goal. So through that process, I kind of realized that I was doing the first step of the process of learning the original piece. I was internalizing what made that piece so special to me. Like, what was it? The harmony? Was it the orchestration? Whatever it was that in that piece that like fundamentally resonated with me, I would have to understand that first. And to me, that was really important because I don't know. I mean, I imagine this is a lot of people, but just hearing a topic or reading about it in a textbook, I might logically understand it, but unless I internalize it, it will never come out in my own writing. Like I can understand a harmony concept and be like, yeah, logically that makes sense. But until I internalize it,
Right.
I'm never going to actually use that harmony concept unless I force myself to. So by doing these covers, I was internalizing a lot more information from the pieces of music that it resonated with me enough that I wanted to cover them. And then on top of that, I was also arranging them into a new style of music, in which case I would also be needing to internalize whatever that new style was and made it sound like that style, and figuring out how I can take the essence of the original piece that I love so much and the essence of the style I was trying to force it into, and then figure out how those musical ideas can work together. And I found that just that process is really, really good at strengthening the just kind of understanding and the internalization of all these musical concepts. And I don't know, that's why I'm a big proponent of people doing arrangements. I think it's a great way to learn.
I imagine it helps with like learning a bunch of different styles too, because you're just so ingrained in whatever style that you're looking at that you're going to
And it's really cool
arrange.
because like I can literally point to it in places where there was a Banjo Kazooie cover I did, which the original Banjo Kazooie cover, the music is just kind of fun, bouncy. I don't know how to describe that instrumentation, but I did it into a J rock style. And at that time, it wasn't that I'd never done J-rock before. I had never done rock before. I'd never written for guitar. I'd never written for like vocals. Like I had done none of these things before. And I was so happy. Like it took a lot of work, but I was so happy with how that arrangement came out that now since then I have used like guitar in my music a lot. I've used a lot of the, like you can literally hear the elements that I did for the first time in that cover in my original work coming out. And yeah, like you're saying, you just learn a lot from that process.
Have you ever used that process? I don't know if you've been teaching music when you've been teaching at the various universities. Have you ever used that process of arranging as a teaching method?
I would really love to, but like I was saying, most of the time my students have no background in music. So to get to the point that they would be able to do that would require
Yeah.
like a couple semesters of work.
It's not happening. Well, I saw that you also are doing a lot of sound design, and you build out a lot of the audio for games. I saw that, I think it was Unreal Engine, that you were doing those footstep sounds and talking about the different the ways you were integrating the different loops of footsteps and the different permutations of them. Can you walk us through like what is the like how do you even get started when you see a project, about what are the audio needs for this and how do you go about fulfilling that?
Yeah. So it definitely depends. Again, I feel like bad because I say that for literally everything, but it really does depend. But I'd say the two fundamental ways, and when I've been doing sound design or implementation or both, is that either the developer has a very specific idea in mind and they come to me and say, like, this is what I want, do this. And then I'm more or less just kind of taking their tasks and going through a checklist and doing everything I want, which sometimes works and sometimes great, but tends to not be the way I would prefer to work, I guess. But then other games, like I can't say the name of it, but one I am working on now has been really great because the game world is more or less built. Like it's not a finished game, but there's a world I could walk around in engine. And I literally would just do that. I would walk around the game world and have like a little spreadsheet open in another window and be like, okay, that needs sound. That's going to need sound. That's going to need sound. That's going to need sound. I start listing out everything that is going to need sound as I'm playing through the game. And inevitably, the list changes over time, but I just get some kind of rough idea of what I'm going to need. Then the next step for me usually is thinking about the way those systems are going to be set up. Because again, like I could say, like, I need these ambiances for these different areas, but how I'm going to integrate that is going to inform the way I would want those ambiances to be created. So, like in this case, I was working in this game in particular, we were working with Fmod. So I actually like created test events in Fmod that had the way ambient systems could work and kind of figuring out what would trigger best in game. And if I in this case, when I actually have access to the build, I will literally just like put in like placeholder sound effects just to test out, okay, how is this going to make sense the most and be the least amount of work but still sound the best, basically. And once I have those systems in place, I will then start, only like once I have those systems in place will I start actually creating the sound effects and figuring out how to work them in. Because otherwise I will end up creating lots of sound effects and then having to go back and change them because they don't fit in with whatever the system is. So it's really tricky too, because especially the way Fmod works, or really most middleware works, is you're calling these specific events from within structures and you have the parameters that are already predefined. So if I'm trying to do this on the fly, it becomes really complicated because I'm going to wind up having to change the file structure or change what bank sounds are in or what parameters are being used for what. And then that means I'm going to have to reattach all those things in Unity. And if I change the name of a file structure, then Unity will no longer be able to find it and I have to reattach it. So just kind of coming up with all those ideas and making sure that they are in place before I start making the sounds makes the whole process a lot easier. And with those Unreal demos you mentioned, which are just demos I did to practice, they're not from a game or anything. That was exactly my process. Is I literally had like a notepad app open and was taking notes on like, okay, how can I set up these systems? And then I didn't create the actual audio sounds until I already had those systems in place and set up and working. And that kind of works a lot better. I guess generally the way I approach it is that I think of it like a puzzle where I know what the end picture is, I know what the end result I want is, and I have to work backwards to figure out how to get the pieces into that end result. And that works a lot better for me.
Is it like 100% of the time when you're doing audio for a game that they have an engine that you're able to look through? You're never brought in like way earlier in the process. It's always when there's some sort of a build.
No, there's definitely times where the former happens as well. And then it's usually just kind of like planning and thinking about looking at concept art and doing the best you can. But I think there's always kind of a sense that when you're working at that early of a stage, that whatever you're doing is to set the vibe and it's not actually going to be the finalized finished product. Like sometimes it works out that way and it works out great and your initial idea is perfect. But there's kind of an expectation that 99% of the time, whatever you create at that stage is going to change before the final thing actually happens.
It's like Sonic concept art, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I've actually used that term in classes before, just thinking of it as like concept art for audio.
I get an A+.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense when you think of it that way because it's the same thing, like you said, that concept artists are doing. Or like, even if there's not a game that I could play in engine, sometimes there'll be like really, really early test footage, and just being able to like work to that linearly, like the way I would with a film, just having something to kind of get across the landscape and the aesthetic. And I'm slightly tangential, but I want to get into this because you brought it up. I really do promote that the audio person being brought in really early. And it's because people tend not to do it because like you mentioned, it's harder when you don't have anything to work with. But I think that fundamentally, when the audio person is there early enough, it makes such a difference because the audio then becomes part of the game rather than the audio being put on top of a game that's already finished.
Right.
And like, there have definitely been projects I've worked on where like, it's like, oh yeah, we have pretty much an entire game that's finished, but we realized we need audio. So can you just like add sound effects to this thing that's already existed? And like, it can work, it's fine. But when the audio is fundamentally part of the development process, it's cool because in some cases, the audio, like the temp audio that I don't expect to be finished, will actually inform the artist so that the artist will hear it in game and be like, oh, that's cool. Let me like work. Like it can actually inform the way the world is built around it.
It feels like it's part of the identity
definitely.
of the game.
And then also, like I was talking about with the integration, where like you have to create all those systems. And if you have all of these game mechanics that are already created, you have to then figure out how to take your audio and drive it based off of the existing game mechanics because you're not part of the system that's creating these processes in the first place. So you have to figure out a way to take what already exists and make that work to your audio rather than being able to make the audio system part of the kind of structure of the game to begin with.
I've never really heard anybody talk about it like that. And that's super fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, and it's those little things that I think make such the difference too, because like, good sounding audio is obviously important and will go so long, but it's that adaptivity that really makes games special to me. Like, this is the first semester I ever taught for a university. I had a student come in and I should back up. The first week of that class, since they tend to not have any background in audio, I just kind of teach critical listening. Like I'm teaching them how to listen for audio in a game and listen to what's happening. And like when you don't even know what to listen for, it's really hard to make something. So that's always the first step is just learning how to listen. And so I kind of teach that critical listening. And then over the years, I've had students come in after that and be like, oh, I noticed this thing in this game I've played for so long that I've never noticed before. But they specifically mentioned, and I want to say it was Red Dead Redemption 2. I want to say it was that game. Might be something else. But they noticed that how, as they fired the gun, the it wasn't just like a bullet firing every time. Like there was something that the bullet sound changed slightly when it was when you were kind of getting low on ammo, to kind of give the player some kind of feedback that something is going to happen, or as the gun was. I hope it's the right game. I might be getting the wrong game, but there was some game where the gun had durability, and as the gun kind of got worn out more, the sound of the firing kind of changed a little bit. And it's
Interesting.
like those things that, unless you're listening for it, you're never going to sit there being like, oh, is that bullet changing slightly as I'm firing it more? But your brain just kind of like picks up on that, and it makes you like kind of more immersed in the game world. Like it really helps draw you in, even if you don't necessarily notice those things.
I
And those
mean,
are the kind of the parts
that's
that,
what they say in film is you don't want to notice the music. You just want to kind of immerse people, and I assume it's the same in games. You don't want people to notice the audio design. You just want it to be immersive.
okay. Do you mind if I go on a tangent on that? Because you just,
Yeah, let's go for it.
because that one is like a big debate I hear a lot. And that's, I mean, I know it comes up in film too, but especially in games, especially when we have adaptivity, the way to make adaptivity really easy is that you kind of make less possible pure mutations. And the way you do that is you write everything in one key, you write everything in one tempo, you make sure everything's in 4, and it makes it a lot easier because you can fundamentally transfer from one thing to another, because they're always going to match up harmonically and meter and rhythmically and stuff. And the big issue that comes up in that is melody. Because as soon as you start trying to change a melody in the middle of a phrase, you have a lot more issues to worry about. So a lot of games will kind of forego melody because it makes it easier to transition between things, because you're not worrying about some long sweeping melody cutting off in the middle. That debate kind of comes up a lot about, like, is this a better way of doing it because it doesn't draw attention to itself? It's kind of adding to the emotion of the scene without kind of making you notice it's doing it. But then at the same time, people argue, and I tend to agree, that you're losing something by not having this melody. You're not going to remember that music. It's not going to have that same connection. And I'm not like all for like I love textural music. I think it works really well. But I also think that that balance of having melody in the game is really important too. But that's the exact argument that comes up, is the melody tends to draw attention to itself. And it's like, is that good?
Right. That is because there are so many iconic game soundtracks, and like those games wouldn't be those games without those soundtracks, without those melodies. And like you said, it becomes a lot more difficult.
If you think about it, the two categories those often fall into are either they're older games where there's less adaptivity, so they kind of didn't worry about that much. Like if you play a lot of older games, it will just stop in the
Right.
middle of the melody, and that's just kind of how it works, and it's fine.
You're just like,
Yeah,
okay.
you just kind of accept it because you're like, this is a game, this is how games work. But I mean, there were some creative things like, uh, I want to. You had Mark Bennis on previously, and he is like the
Right.
master of knowing about how these Pokemon music worked. But that game,
The Pokemon
that one
games.
does really cool things that using adaptivity in ways that aren't how adaptive music work now, but kept the melody fresh. That I don't want to get into, but look up Mark's stuff if you want to do a deep dive into that. And then the other part of it is that I often hear is that Japanese games tend to have a lot more melodic driven stuff than games that are made in the West, or particularly in the US. And it's just kind of a fundamentally different way of doing it. But as you can notice, if you play a lot of JRPGs or Japanese games, there wasn't the same the same kind of adaptation we have in Western games. They just generally didn't have, like, they weren't adapting in the same way. They weren't as they didn't flow between states nearly as much as the way Western games were. And now that's changing. Now they're kind of doing. I'm wording this so carefully because I don't want it to sound like I'm saying one is better than the other, because I don't think one is better than the other. I just think they're fundamentally different ways of approaching it.
Right.
But now you're seeing a lot more Japanese games using those adaptive music techniques that are similar, like the vertical stuff and the horizontal stuff that we've been doing for a while. But since they kind of worked on it longer before fully going into it, they still are finding a lot of really creative ways to create these immersive experiences while also having these long, beautiful, sweeping melodies that those games tend to be known for. And I think now, in my opinion, it's really hitting its stride with a lot of JRPGs, that you're getting that balance of these beautiful melodies while also being adaptive and feeling like they're happening in real time. And just to caveat that, yes, like that's definitely a generalization and a huge generalization, but whenever I say things like that, I'm always like I know that there's a billion examples that can point to the counter of what I'm saying. I'm just generally what I've observed.
Hey, that's a good sign of somebody who's well informed, that they know all of the things that break the generalization they're making. Yeah, I mean, that is just such a fascinating debate, and it's interesting because game music is becoming more and more popular, and is getting into the concert halls and stuff, and it is a lot of that old school Japanese stuff that has become so iconic. And I'm wondering, 20 years from now, what are going to be the iconic game soundtracks that we're going to hear?
I think about that a lot, and it's one of those questions where I don't think I can answer, and not because I can't tell the future, but because I am so deep in game music that I just have no concept of like what is actually popular and what is popular within game music.
Right.
Like I have a lot of friends who don't work in games, and I'll talk to them about stuff, and I'll be like, yeah, it's this like this thing that I think everyone is talking about, that I think everyone knows is like the quintessential amazing thing, and they're like, I have no idea what that is. And I'm like, oh right, it's just my world that is really in love with this one specific thing.
Yeah, we're really in our worlds of our own here, little niches. Do you have any upcoming projects? Could be music, sound design.
Yeah,
audio.
I mean,
what are you working on?
I always struggle with this question because usually I can't talk about things until they're already. I mean, Game of Fortune, I could talk about that one. The Death Game visual novel that's coming out in early 2023. No specific date yet, but I'm really excited about that one because I got a lot of fun with the music, and the game is fun. I also am a big proponent of visual novels, so if you're not familiar with visual novels and you like horror thriller stuff, I definitely recommend checking that one out. And then beyond that, it's usually just my arrangement work that I am able to talk about because it's just me, so I could do whatever I want. But I'm currently working on a Sailor Moon cover and I actually can't say that one. I'm working on a couple of anime covers. I know what I just said and contradicted myself, but long story. But I'm working on a couple of anime covers that should be coming out within the next, I don't know, I take forever to do this stuff. Within the next year, at some point, those will come out. So check those out.
Great. I mean, this has been really, really cool to get your insight on a lot of this stuff and see how you approach music and sound and arranging and how they all impact one another. Do you have a website or anything you'd like to plug for people to go and check out your stuff?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have all the social medias, but it's not consistent. So if you just go to jeffpenny.com, you can find links to all the different socials, and except TikTok, but that one's just my name. So if you're on TikTok and you want to check me out, it's just my name.
And we'll, of course, have links for all of that in the description. So, Jeff, it's been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.
Jeff had some fascinating insights into the world of game music and audio. You can, of course, listen to everything we mentioned in the link dump in this episode's description. Thanks for listening to The Scorekeepers. The Scorekeepers is produced by Daniel Farrell Music and Sound, with graphic and visual design by Patrick Farrell. Scorekeepers is proudly hosted and recorded using Zencaster. Make sure you subscribe to hear new episodes of The Scorekeepers wherever you listen. And be sure to rate and review this episode to help us find new listeners. Thanks for listening.